Conville and welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. Today I want to talk about something potentially controversial. I don't think it is, but we'll wait and see. I'll let you guys be the judge. What I'm talking about is, what do we as Western, white, generally English speaking watch collectors, how do we think about our hobby? Where do we fit into the world? Okay, I'm going to be referring to some notes through this, so forgive me, it's not going to be as polished as I'd like, but it was a tricky subject and I wanted to make sure I got it right. So, you know, sometimes there are those things you know you just shouldn't do, but you just have to. That last piece of pizza you know you shouldn't eat, that last beer that you know you shouldn't drink, or in my case, that one comment that is so tasty on the YouTube you know you shouldn't reply, but you just have to. And that's really where I got sucked into. About a week ago, there was a comment which was so lacking in self-awareness, so lacking in sort of any kind of thought, of depth of thought, I just had to respond. Like that last beer that sends you to drive the porcelain bus, this was a disaster. It went completely sideways. The kind of person who makes that kind of comment isn't the kind of person you want to get involved with, so you block, bail and just leave. But I'm still left with some of the thoughts that came up. And so that's really what I want to talk about today, which is when we're thinking about the market, when we're thinking about brands and where they go and what their inventory looks like, we seem to naturally assume that it's all about us, that it's all about the Western consumer, it's all about what we see. And you certainly see that on YouTube. It's all about people talking about what we see in our marketplace. And I found myself thinking, are we getting this completely wrong? So the questions I really came up with were, how important are we to the market? How representative are we of all the watches, and in particular I'm talking here about the Swiss, of all the watches that the Swiss sell? And when we talk about a brand, or we talk about their inventory, or we talk about their catalogue, are we just speaking out of our asses? Are we completely off the ball? So what I wanted to do was I just wanted to start down the path and think about where might I find answers to those questions and what might they tell me. Okay, so there's a site, Federation something horology, run by the Swiss watch industry, where they provide quite a bit of detail about what with Swiss watch sales. I'm going to here's a chart which talks about the distribution of Swiss watch exports by region. As you can see, in 2017, Asia received 12 million units for a total price of around about 10 billion Swiss francs. That represents 50% of the Swiss watch exports, and that was an increase of 5% over the previous year. Europe took 8.6 million units at a value of about 6.7 billion Swiss francs, representing 34% of their exports, which was an increase of 2.6%. America, and it's really important here to say America bought 3.4 million units at a total value of 3.8 billion Swiss francs, which constitutes 14% of the market, and that's a 2.7% decrease from 2016. What's really interesting is that 2.7% decrease could have been far worse, except for significant growth in South America. South American unit numbers are huge, prices are quite low, but it looks as though the prices of the watches selling in South America is increasing rapidly. Whether their purchasing reflects normal English-speaking North America, no idea. Okay. So some of the first part of our question really gets answered here. We are important. If we define we as the West, Europe and America, we are important. We constitute around about 48% of the marketplace, but that is less than Asia. We're going backwards. And a little sub point, South America is a place to watch. That would be interesting to see what happens there. Okay, so from there, the data could take us in all sorts of interesting places, but I want to keep this manageable. So let's look at the country tables And I'm kind of going to make a dangerous assumption of assuming that the bulk of Hong Kong watches go to mainland China. That seems to be, I did some research looking at Hong Kong sales exports from their industry, and they largely agree that the bulk of Hong Kong sales seem to end up making it. And that's watches sold from China to, sorry, watches sold from Switzerland to Hong Kong eventually find their way back into China. And so if you look at China plus Hong Kong, that represents sales of around about 4.6 billion Swiss francs a year, or to put it another way, twice that of the United States. So the next thing I wanted to do was find out, well, what's going on in the Chinese industry? What are they buying? So I did a quick Google search again, came up with an article from the South China Sea Post, which one of those classic sort of magazine articles, the top 5, the hot 5 brands selling in luxury Swiss watch brands selling in China. Good place to start. The first came in at Longines. Now that's not totally surprising. It's a large brand. They have a lot of commercial. They have a lot of commercials. Not surprising that they would get a mention in something like this. Then came a couple of very predictable choices: Rolex, Omega, and Patek. So again, absolutely no surprise. In fact, no, I take that back. It was Patek and Omega at this point. Sorry, very important, because the next brand was Piaget. Yes, Piaget. A brand which is at best kind of irrelevant in the West in terms of YouTubers. It's just not spoken about ever. Then came Rolex. So let's get that straight. In order, the South China Sea Post is saying that the 5 big brands driving Swiss exports into China are Longines, Omega, Patek, Piaget, then Rolex. So, okay, maybe that's a quirk. Often in these magazine pieces, they're paid promotions. They're bought. So perhaps that's not really that trustworthy. So let's do another search. This time I come up with a site from a company called Barron's. They do this kind of investment luxury stuff. And they're not so much looking at sales, because they didn't have sales data. They do a search, and they did a whole bunch of research in the demographic that buy Swiss watches, asking for what brands do they recognize and what brands do they think they're going to buy from next. And again, let me check my notes. Their findings were a little bit different, broadly in line, but a little bit different. They found Cartier on top as the brand most likely to be purchased in the next 12 months. Longines in second. Omega and Rolex next in 3 and 4, but they noted that they were slipping fast due to price concerns, and that the risers were IW&C and Bulgari. Again, another fashion brand which barely makes it onto the radar on most kind of Western YouTube watching kind of brands, and yet in China is one of the fast movers, one of the growers. Okay, so what's that telling us? I think it's telling us that the staples of the Swiss industry in our world, in the West, Omega, Patek, Cartier, Rolex, they're certainly still big in China. So there's a fair degree of overlap there. But there are brands in the West which are kind of peripheral or not really centre to our thoughts, such as Longines, Bulgari, Piaget, that are huge players, that are big and significant, top 10, maybe even top place players. Okay, and so I think the one takeaway I would take at this point is Longines. Longines, everywhere I look, they are regarded as the brand to watch and the brand that we should be thinking about. Okay, so I did some more research on Longines. I specifically started searching Google saying, tell me about Longines in China. And I came upon an article, again, about a year old, unfortunately. That's just the problem of searching the English-speaking internet about things that are happening in China. It's difficult to stay up to date. But there's a watch publication which is both Chinese language and English, called Europe Star. Seems to be quite reputable, and they had an interview with the CEO of Longines, which is always a good place to start, and the title is Longines, an Empire in China Case Study. So excellent, nails it. Now, it starts with the section that says basically Longines is a big brand in China, not that well known in America, not that well known in the West, but you know, as the 4th biggest brand in the world. Hang on, back up the truck. Did you just say the 4th biggest brand in the world? Sorry, I think I might have misspoken there. But yeah, this article was saying that Longines is the 4th biggest watch brand in the world. So I've got to check this before I go any more. I'm not reading this article. I've put it to one side. It's very difficult to do. Okay, so the first thing I did was I went to the Swatch Group record reports from I think they're from January 2018. And sure enough, there's not a lot of detail there, but there are some snippets. The 2017 revenues for the Swatch Group were in the order of 7.9 billion Swiss francs. And Longines, on the other hand, is on track for total watch sale income of 2 billion Swiss francs per year in the medium term. Okay, so what's the medium term? Is it 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? It's probably, mostly in the industry, they talk in terms of 1 to 3 years. So that would mean that Longines represents essentially a quarter of the Swatch Group income. So that's a group that involves Swatch, Mido, Hamilton, Blancpain, Omega obviously, and God, probably about a dozen other brands I can't list straight off my head. And Longines represents a full quarter of their income. Okay, so you know what? At this point, I'll accept your argument that they are probably, that would make them certainly the biggest unit within Swatch Group, and that probably does put them up around the top 4 in the world. So, we'll take that. We'll say they are probably the 4th biggest brand in the world, and they're huge in China apparently. So what did they say? What they said was, the Chinese remain enthusiastic about mechanical watches. The head of Longines remind us that these represent 90% of the brand's sales in the country. They also adore models sold as pairs, which represent 60% of sales. Our brand is perceived as offering the best quality for money in the 1,000 to 3,000 franc segment. It is recognized as a legitimate brand and not a passing trend, and is appreciated for its classical style and elegance, continues I think it's affable, it's not a very good translation, Von Canal. The well-balanced brand is also equitable in terms of models available to women as opposed to men. In China, more than 50% of its sales are to women. Now this is really strange, so let's unpack that. 90% of the sales are mechanical, so they're not your cheap and cheerful quartz movements. They're solid quality mechanical watches. 50% of these are sold in pairs, so in other words, there's a men's watch and a women's watch. Sorry, 60% are sold as pairs, and more than 50% of the watches in total are sold as women's watches. So if you're looking at the Longines catalogue, that really points us towards the Elegance, Master and Records collection. In all of these, the watches that Longines the Longines make pairs of men's and women's watches, where the men's come in at around about 38 mils and the women's come in at about 25 mils. These aren't super cheap quartz movements in Australian dollars. These are routinely probably about $1,700 to $3,000 watches. So in US that would make it $1,200 to just over $2,200 US. And they're all watches that get no coverage in Australia or no coverage in the Western media at all. Try and jump on and look for a search about these and you won't find them. Okay, After, so we've done this research, we've found out that Longines has got it, seems to be selling hundreds, thousands, millions of watches of a type that we never really find discussed on the web. I actually did some more searching to find, could I find details about these watches on the web? Curiously, there are some on some of the, I'll call them the paid, the professional media tends to cover some of these. So one of the professional media sites I like is Time and Tide, another good Australian brand. They do tend to cover these things, but then the natural reaction is, well, of course they would, they're paid to. But at least they give them some air. But on the normal sort of like make my subscribers happy kind of vlogger circuit, these watches may as well not exist. What was really interesting is I did find one vlogger, Federico from Federico Talks Watches, who actually did an extended segment talking specifically about Longines and its place in the market and where it was going. And before I go on, let me say I love Federico. He's one of the guys that I never miss his stuff. I'm not accusing him of anything here except being very representative of the rest of all of us in this space. In a discussion on Longines and its direction, he said he kind of likes the heritage stuff and there is evidence of real quality in there, but there's the inventory and the catalogues all bloated with this stuff that doesn't make any sense. All these weird, elegance watches and things which don't seem to have a place, and he thinks it's just dragging the market down. After that, there was another interview a little while later where he did a spot with Tim Mosso on the Watchbox, basically repeating the same thing, and Tim joined in and agreed completely. And between them, they agreed that really Longines needs to pull itself together, clear out its inventory, perhaps lift itself up so it could compete at that, get out of the mall store and the department store and get into competing with up in the area that Omega used to be at. Curiously, when you look at the numbers, that's a recipe for loss. That's a recipe for disaster. That says, to go back to what the Chinese have said. So in other words, lift yourself out of the single most popular part of the Chinese market. Lift yourself out of that part where you are just killing it and you are dominating the world. That has made you the fourth biggest seller just to suit us and our ideas of what you should be. So really, that's when I thought, you know what, we do have a problem. So with that in mind, let's go back to the original questions and let's just sum this up now that we've been down that rabbit hole and had a look at things. Are we in the West, do we drive the watch industry? I think the first answer is, from this chart, very easy to see, no we don't. At best we represent 50% of the watch market. China and Asia generally is huge and growing fast. That said, there's a bit of overlap between the Western and the Eastern markets. And so if you consider the overlap and if you consider the if you consider the market shares that we have, I think you could safely say that somewhere between 50 and 60% of the markets kind of overlap. And so what that means is the things that we think we know about the market are probably 50, 60, maybe 70% right. But what it also means is that in at least 30% of the marketplace, we have no idea what we're talking about. In at least 30% of the cases where we look at something and say, oh, clearly this is what the brand should say, we're almost certainly going to be wrong because we haven't considered other markets, other places where the watches that we think are great aren't, and the watches that we think are rubbish are in fact great. So what's the takeaway? I think the takeaway is that we need to throttle back on the arrogance a little bit. We need to back off, and when we're thinking about the direction of the watch market and when we're thinking about the directions of the watch industry, we need to consciously step back and recognize that we are looking at it through our very unique lens, our lens that constitutes less than half the market. And that's not to say that we necessarily have to bow to what the Chinese are saying. I'm not for an instant saying that we have to somehow become like the East. But what I'm saying is that when we as YouTubers, when we as consumers are sitting down and saying this is what the brand should do, bear in mind they might not care what you think. And that's okay. Okay, that's really about it. I just wanted to get that off my chest. I don't know what it means, but I think I like to, it's sort of typical of what I want to do here. I want to think about things that are a little bit different and talk about ideas that I don't see being talked about anywhere else. So if you like that idea, let me know. Like and subscribe. I'd really like some comments. If there's anyone, one whoever sees this who is actually like a Chinese or Asian market watcher, I would love to get some input from you. Please write in English. I apologise, that's the only language I can cover. And give your perspective. I find myself wondering if there's a Chinese vlogger out there saying the Longines market would be great if only they could get rid of all that crappy heritage stuff. That would just be hilarious. Anyway, thanks very much. Thanks for watching. Catch you later.